All right, it is my privilege to introduce the following speakers. But first, I do also want to give a brief shout out to Nigel in gratitude for all the good things you have done, both in the world, but also in my life and in my family's life during our 2-year tenure here and beyond. So I look forward to much more collaboration and wish you all the best. It is my privilege to introduce Dr. Christopher Eberle. Chris is a professor of ethics at the United States Naval Academy. Go Navy. Thank you. It's on the record. Who will be speaking on faith and battle through speaking about the story of Marine Officer Timothy Stravin. And also we have Dr. James Orr, who is assistant professor of the philosophy of religion at Cambridge University. It will be the same structure as previously. Chris will speak for about 40 minutes. We'll do questions, and then we'll have the second speaker for the equal amount of time. So, Chris, the question's yours.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here. Honestly, it's. Can you hear me in the back? Are we good? Yeah. Okay, good. All right. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to chat with you all. It's been terrific, and I'm looking forward to a nice dialogue with you all. So let me begin. So I'm grateful for this opportunity to honor Nigel Bigger's many years of service as a Christian ethicist. He's embraced a pastoral responsibility to provide moral guidance helpful to those who operate in the field. I'm most thankful he's done so with exemplary care, attention to detail, and moral insight. Nigel does Christian casuistry as well as anyone I know. It's for this reason I've often used his work to reflect on the duties of officership with my students, almost all of whom eventually enter that vocation in the U.S. Navy or Marines. I hope that's done some good, and hope is all you have when educating undergrads. Nigel's detailed, situation-sensitive analyses inspire my discussion today. With as much granularity as I'm able to muster, so I have to say there'll be no Aquinas, there'll be no Barth, there'll be no Augustine. The only theologian we're going to run across is a 24-year-old Marine and his thoughts and actions in war. So I'm going to try to muster as much granularity as I can, and I'm going to explore how Christian moral teaching can and has shaped deliberation in the very interstices of war, the face-to-face violence between small units in the context of urban combat. I'll focus throughout on a young Marine lieutenant and how he tried to comply with the requirement that, as Nigel says, love of neighbor must qualify the way combatants employ military violence. In so doing, I intend to support one of his more controversial claims, that is, that Christian love, robustly understood, can walk the battlefield. It's another of Nigel's phrases, though I doubt it must do so exactly as Nigel recommends. I'll also briefly reflect on the role that religious faith properly plays in the professional decisions of officers who serve in the military of a liberal democracy. So I'm going to cover two topics that Nigel has written about a lot: the ethics of war and the relevance of Christian morality to the ethics of war, and also religion in public, and in particular public officials. So, to that young Marine. Lieutenant Tim Stravin, deployed to Iraq as a platoon commander in the 1st Marine Division, one of the most decorated units in U.S. military history. He commanded his platoon during the November 2004 assault on Fallujah, a city of roughly 300,000 inhabitants, and at the time, the heart of an increasingly lethal insurgency. Fallujah incorporated 400,000 rooms in 50,000 buildings. His mission for some 3 weeks was to move from house to house, killing or capturing any insurgents that they encountered. It so happens that Stravin was driven by his Christian faith to disagree with his fellow Marines about how best to achieve the mission, and so I'm going to focus on the disagreement between Stravin and his fellow Marines. let me lay out a bit of the tactical background to their disagreement. I just want to note that I'm going to focus mostly on less argument than I'm used to, more narrative. The story itself is interesting, and I hope it'll provide the basis for an interesting conversation. I'll have something more systematic to say at the end, but the focus is mainly on Stravin and his disagreement. So suppose that some of Stravin's Marines approach a particular house. It appears dormant. There's no indication of any human being therein. No enemy fire, no white flags, nothing to indicate either danger or the absence thereof. Given what they know, the house might be empty, contain insurgents who have set up an ambush, or shelter harmless, uninvolved civilians. Although his Marines must enter the house, they have no reliable way of determining which of those possibilities has been actualized. Given what they know, who and what lies within is inscrutable. As an officer, Stravin is responsible for managing the violence employed by his subordinates. So circumstanced, he has a whole spread of resources at his disposal. For example, he can, I'm going to lay out 4 sort of numbered propositions. You can't completely take the analytic philosopher out of people. So 1, he can order indirect fire from artillery and then have his Marines enter the house, killing the insurgents who resist, capturing any who surrender, and sparing any surviving non-combatants. That's a very aggressive tactical policy. Here's a somewhat less aggressive alternative. 2, he can send tank rounds into the house and then have his Marines enter, killing the insurgents who resist, capturing those who surrender, and sparing any surviving non-combatants. And then here's a 3rd, a more restrained policy. He can dispense with indirect fire and tank rounds and have his Marines prepare entry with grenades. And a 4th, even more cautious alternative. He can have his Marines enter the building without any preparatory indirect fire, tank shells, or grenades. These 4 options differ in important respects. The most aggressive policy, 1, artillery, is the most dangerous for those in the house, insurgents and otherwise. And so the least dangerous it's the most dangerous for those in the house and the least dangerous for Stravin's Marines. 2, tanks, is far less destructive than 1, but still reduces the risk to Stravin's platoon, not least because it helps them avoid ambushes that focus on fixed entry points. So you don't have to enter to the front door. You make an entrance on the side door. 3, grenades, reduces risk to any non-combatants in the house, and it also provides greater opportunity for enemies to surrender. While 4 is the safest policy for the non-combatants, is least effective in killing those determined to fight to the end, and therefore poses the greatest danger to Stravin's platoon. Many of Stravin's fellow Marines favored the aggressive tactical policy captured in 2, tank shells. Here I briefly reconstruct a common rationale in its support, one that incorporates a weighted assessment of considerations regarding enemy combatants, friendly combatants, and non-combatants. So I'm reconstructing a rationale you can gather by reading the memorial literature on the war in Iraq and then Fallujah. They weren't wandering through Fallujah with like ethical tomes with them. So this is a kind of reconstruction of how they were thinking about things. The same will be true of my reconstruction of Stravin's views. So let me address each of these considerations really briefly. So first, for months prior to the assault, the Fallujah insurgency conducted a bombing campaign that threatened to engulf Iraq in a civil war between Sunnis and Shiites. Its pacification was therefore essential to preventing a moral catastrophe, and the only way to do so under the circumstances was for American Marines and their allies to kill or capture the insurgents operating out of Fallujah. Hence their mission to clear houses, a weighty duty that many took to count in favor of tactical aggression. Second, Stravin and his Marines were also duty-bound to protect one another. This duty is constitutive of the social role of Marine. Plausibly, the greater the danger, the greater its normative weight, and the danger was very great. Fallujah sheltered a significant number of determined enemies, some of whom had considerable experience in urban combat. They had months to prepare for the American assault, burying IEDs, registering mortars, preparing kill zones. Some used drugs that enabled them to continue to fight long after they would otherwise have been incapacitated. Given that they had to attack a prepared position defended by experienced, determined, and drug-enhanced enemies, Stravin's Marines took their duty to protect one another to count powerfully in favor of tactical aggression. Third, Stravin's Marines discounted the normative weight of the main consideration that counts in favor of tactical caution, the duty of Marines to refrain from harming noncombatants. For weeks prior to the attack, the population of Fallujah was warned of the impending battle. The Americans encouraged, cajoled, and even mildly coerced ordinary citizens to vacate. Just days before the attack, they turned off electricity in order to induce an exodus. By the beginning of the assault, the vast majority, around 90%, was gone. Many Marines believed that the decision of the remaining citizens not to exit reduced the level of risk that they were required to assume in order to avoid unintended harm to innocents. So the idea is not that they become combatants, but that the level of risk the Marines were required to assume was lowered by their decision to stay. They took this greatly to mitigate the case in favor of tactical caution. So, in short, two powerful reasons counted in favor of tactical aggression. The primary reason in favor of caution was considerably discounted, and so many Marines took themselves to have a compelling reason to fire tank rounds into buildings from which they antecedently perceived no lethal threat, and which contained, for all they knew, indeterminate numbers of harmless and terrified human beings. After the death of a particularly beloved Marine, this rationale led one officer to impose a tactical policy akin to 2 tank shells on his subordinates. No more clearing houses with Marines. Rockets first, then Marines. Stravin disagreed. He assessed the various considerations relevant to the tactical decision before him in light of Christian moral teaching, and he was led by that assessment to impose on his platoon a cautious policy roughly captured by 4, and I hope you can imagine the controversy. We'll get into it in a little bit. I'll begin by considering 3 respects in which Christian moral teaching shaped his deliberations about Fallujah noncombatants. First, his faith helped him overcome a deliberative distortion very common in war, that threats to unit insiders blot out of awareness the moral standing of unit outsiders. When the people that you love are threatened with lethal violence, it tends to limit the scope of moral concern. Christians believe, Stravin thought, that the duty to love neighbors is absolute. This duty has an indefinitely wide scope. It applies to any human being upon whom one happens. As exemplified in the parable of the Good Samaritan, it applies to the kind of circumstance in which Stravin found himself, to encounters between hostile groups. As a consequence, he embraced a duty to love each human being he encountered in the Fallujah battle space. This shaped the way he led his Marines in battle, and so I have a number of quotations from him to sort of capture his view. These are all just from conversations I've had with him. So I wanted to set an example for my Marines, that I was going to treat every single Iraqi with whom I would interact as a child of God, made in his image, a very difficult thing to do in that circumstance. Second, his faith provided reason to give especially great normative weight to the protection of noncombatants. He understood love of neighbor to require particular care for the most vulnerable human beings we encounter. Plausibly, the most vulnerable human beings in Stravin's battle space were the Fallujah noncombatants. They were caught up in a vicious conflict in which they were utterly unable to protect themselves from dismemberment, suffering, and death. This provided him with significant reason to favor tactical caution. So here he is again. I felt a deep responsibility for innocent Iraqi civilians who were caught up in a crossfire of a really nasty conflict, to ensure the insurgents weren't going to damage them and that my Marines weren't going to do that either. I was careful to emphasize to my Marines that we could expect innocent civilians to remain in the city. And we need to operate with that as a likely outcome for every house we entered and every round we fired. Third, Stravin could grant to his subordinates that, so this is referring now to the rationale that persuaded his fellow Marines to adopt a more aggressive policy. Stravin could grant to his subordinates that Fallujah's noncombatants possessed no right that his Marines assume the level of risk associated with 4, the more cautious policy, and still believe that he ought to impose it on them. After all, properly obedient love can require us to benefit those who have no right to the goods we are positioned to provide them. Given that Fallujah's non-combatants were more likely to survive if his Marines proceeded with caution rather than aggression, Stravin had powerful reason to impose 4 on his platoon. This is paradigmatic, obedient love, self-sacrificial beneficence for foolish, fearful, or unfortunate human beings with whom we have no personal attachment whatsoever and who do not themselves have any right to our beneficence. For Stravin, it was a natural expression of his Christian faith. Stravin's faith also shaped his treatment of enemy combatants. There is, of course, a long history of reflection about how Christian neighbor love bears on how combatants treat their enemies. One interpretation or caricature is that they must act absent certain kinds of negative emotional states, hatred, malice, and the like. That is, the injunction to love neighbors has nothing to do with who combatants kill, which weapons they employ, or how they use those weapons, and everything to do with the attitudinal states that accompany the use of military violence. Stravin took the injunction to love enemies to have both attitudinal and tactical implications. One of those tactical implications was to fight in such a way as to provide his enemies with the leeway to surrender. Here's Stravin again. For me, one way to love our enemies is to provide an opportunity for surrender, should they choose not to fight. And this he could do by imposing a cautious policy on his Marines. And as it turns out, Stravin's caution had concrete results. His unit became known as the Puck Platoon. Puck is an acronym denoting a person under control, a prisoner of war. Apparently, his platoon garnered a disproportionately high number of pucks. For Stravin, this statistical reality was a manifestation of his compliance with Jesus' command to love his enemies. It also caused great controversy. My Marines chafed at my approach, and frankly, I was constantly pulling back on the reins to slow and quell their aggression. The rest of the company took notice, especially regarding surrendered combatants. Let me tell you, my hard-charging, intense Marines did not like being called the Puck Platoon. Underneath the criticism is the thought that we should have killed them, not taken them prisoner. Not kill them after they became a prisoner, but not give them the chance to surrender. That's the idea. So I turn now to Stravin's deliberations regarding unit outsiders, insurgents, and non-combatants, from deliberations regarding unit outsiders to those regarding unit insiders, his fellow Marines. This makes him sound very outwardly directed, right? But he has duties to his subordinates. He's got duties to the members of his platoon. And this is an absolutely vital discussion, right? After all, an officer's delegated military authority only given that he properly cares for the well-being of his subordinates. And many doubted that Stravin's imposition of 4, again, going in without tank rounds or grenades or anything like that, was compatible with that duty to care for his subordinates. In order to appreciate why he disagreed, we have to reflect on the internal complexity of his duty to care. At the heart of any adequate conception thereof is a responsibility to protect subordinates from bodily evil, from being killed, maimed, and dismembered. Under the circumstances, we can certainly see why Stravin or any other officer or any other Marine might adopt a conception of the duty to care that, at the very least, significantly prioritizes protection from bodily harm, and so favors tactical aggression. But bodily harm isn't the only kind of evil that threatened his subordinates. There's now a large literature on the manner in which combat causes moral injury. Right? Mark's got a new book out that's on that topic that's terrific. And this literature indicates that officers must be solicitous both not only of the bodily, but also of the moral well-being of their subordinates. Stravin believed that requiring tactical caution reduced the risk of moral injury. Just how it's complicated, given that there are distinct kinds of moral injury, and I've been told I got 25 minutes, and so I'm going to summarize. But this is a very complicated discussion, I think. So first, his imposition of tactical caution straightforwardly decreased the likelihood that his Marines would kill innocent Fallujians, which is, of course, a common source of moral injury. Second, it discouraged hostile emotions that can render otherwise permissible acts of military violence corrupt and so injurious. Third, and perhaps most controversially, it could help his subordinates resist a hatred for enemy combatants that precluded friendship with God. Suffice to say that Stravin concluded that his imposition of tactical caution protected his subordinates from an appropriately weighted balance of evils, bodily moral, and spiritual. His willingness so to impose, even in the face of their express disagreement, was a manifestation of his love for them. So, with respect to each of the considerations relevant to the tactical decision before him, Christian love provided Stravin with reason to adopt a more cautious tactical policy than that favored by his fellow Marines. As a consequence, he refused to direct artillery to bomb, tanks to shell, or Marines to lob grenades into houses in order to neutralize threats that might or might not lie within. Rather, he resolved to adopt something like 4 as a tactical default, escalating the violence that his platoon employed in accord with the level of perceived threat. So that's my explication of Stravin and his rationale for tactical caution. And now let me turn to some slightly more systematic reflections. As I see it, Stravin exemplifies in detail how love can walk the battlefield. If Nigel is correct, killing in war can be an expression of, or at least be properly qualified by Christian neighbor love when it, and this is a quotation from Nigel's In Defense of War, and one of the most important sentences in that book, so I think. So Christian neighbor love if Nigel's correct, killing in war can be an expression of Christian neighbor love when it, quote, refuses violence, intends to stop the wrongdoer from doing wrong, intends that he not resume it, would be content to achieve that aim by persuading him to surrender, and restrains the use of violence according to its intentions, end quote. I take it that this is nearly an exact description of what Stravin did, of Stravin's practice. His overall aim was to prevent insurgents from initiating a civil catastrophe. He clearly hoped that his enemies would surrender rather than fight, and he moderated the level of violence that his platoon employed in order to make it so. To which I would also add, he did so at significant risk both to himself and his platoon. In so doing, he exemplifies not only how sacrificial love can walk the battlefield, but how sacrificial enemy love can do so. Oh, that's just not right. Okay. So, even so, Stravin departs from Nigel's recommendations in a number of respects. And I'll briefly mention one. Nigel and I were talking about this a little bit before, just a second ago. I take it that Stravin permissibly violated Nigel's oft-stated claim that combatants may not intentionally kill their enemies. I'd love to say a lot more about this than time allows. Suffice to say that Stravin didn't kill his enemies as an intrinsic good or a primary aim, and that's the formulation that Nigel often gives to sort of his understanding of intentional killing in war, or the prohibition thereof. Rather, Stravin intended to kill his enemies as a means necessary to achieve a morally obligatory mission. He did so reluctantly, to be sure, and thus hoped that his enemies would surrender before his Marines were compelled to kill them. But reluctance doesn't preclude intention. We can fully intend to do what we are manifestly reluctant to do. Moreover, his treatment of surrendering or incapacitated enemies comports with his intention to kill them, a possibility Nigel seems in a number of occasions to deny. So Nigel has said in a couple of places, right? If your intention is to kill your enemies, then when you've tried to kill them and they survive, if your goal is to kill them, you're going to execute them after they've if they haven't been killed by your violence. And I think, I think that's not right. I think that there's another way of understanding it. So as I see it, the fact that Stravin took prisoners reflects the fact that he intended to kill Fallujah insurgents as a means, and only as a means, to a morally obligatory end, such that when their death no longer served that end, he forbade his Marines to kill them. Right? So, and I think that that's unavoidable in war. The intentional killing of enemy combatants is unavoidable as a means to morally required ends. So I realize that that's less an argument than, I hope you're not offended by this, but that's less an argument than an academic version of a drive-by shooting, right? I mean, Nigel's views are really complicated and they've developed over time, and I would love to have this conversation with you all and Nigel about intentional killing in war. And what I've done doesn't nearly do justice to the complexity of Nigel's views. And I here want to turn to a different kind of normative question, one naturally elicited by the critical role of Stravin's faith. And since I have 3 minutes left, I'm just going to right? So I'll just lay out the issue and we can chat about it later on, right? So there's a big literature out there on the proper role of religious reasons in public life. Nigel has contributed to it in a number of different occasions. It typically focuses on the duties of citizens, at least historically speaking. Can citizens support coercive laws on the basis of their religious beliefs? I think that sort of debate has gone by. That's my understanding. It's focused more now on the duties of public officials, right? So official statements by legislators or in official documents. And but so people have talked about public officials, citizens. Nobody talks about military officers, although they're public officials. And so what I do at the end of this thing that I'm not going to talk with you about is, how does this apply to a military officer? And so let me just lay it right. You can see why somebody might be troubled by there's lots of reasons why people might be troubled by what Tim Stravin did, right? My understanding of what he did is he when he reflected on the decision that he had to make, he relied on his faith in a way that depended decisively. The decision he made depended decisively for its justification on his appeal to Christian love. And so if he had reflected, this is a biographical fact, not a metaphysical necessity, right? It's not saying that there are no secular arguments to that conclusion. It's just when he deliberated about the issue and he had to make a decision, the only reason or a decisive reason for adopting a cautious policy was grounded on his faith. And if he hadn't done that, relied on his faith, he would have adopted a much more aggressive policy, as he actually did earlier on in his deployment to Iraq. So the question is, right, is that okay? Right? Is it okay Tim, an officer, has public authority, has the authority to impose moral and legal obligations on their subordinates by way of issuing them commands. And he has the discretion to make those determinations. Right? Nobody told him that he couldn't make this decision. Another company officer did issue that order to his subordinates, but Tim didn't receive the order, wasn't prohibited from doing that. So on a kind of very intuitive understanding of what it means to impose your faith on someone else, like I'm thinking here of some of you like Michael Perry and his most recent work on religion in public, right? This counts as a religious imposition, right? And is inappropriate in a liberal democracy, right? For that reason. As you all know, that can be the argument can be a lot more complicated than that, and I'm happy to chat about it. And my view on this is I have a very simple, the argument is relatively easy to articulate. Officers need to be willing to comply with the legal orders of those who have authority over them. So they're just not free agents. You have to submit to authority. There's just great reasons for that. Civilian control of the military, good order and discipline in the military. In this context, Tim had the discretion to make this determination. We want officers to rely on deeply held moral beliefs when they employ military violence, right? We citizens provide them with these weapons. They destroy lives. And we, the citizenry, have a duty, I think, to insist that officers rely on moral considerations to guide their use of military violence. And the simple version of this argument, we can have a long conversation. This is a long argument, right? There are no relevant differences between the moral reasons that we should insist officers rely on when they employ military violence and the kind of religious reason that Tim relied on in making his determination. So it's a kind of no relevant differences argument that I've articulated in a number of different cases, and I'm happy to chat about here. So my view is that kind of imposition is morally permissible. There's nothing necessarily criticizable about his view, even though he's using his faith to impose rules on his subordinates that they believed and that could easily have resulted in their death or dismemberment. So issues of the greatest weight can be determined by a person's faith commitments, justified by them. Okay, I'm good.
Thank you very much, Chris. Obviously, it is time for questions now. I've been asked to encourage you to remember a question is a short interrogative, typically ending in a period, or not a period, a question mark. See, I'm already setting the stage for disaster. Here we go. Up here in front, please.
Thank you very much. A fascinating address, and I particularly enjoyed it as a former infantry platoon commander. Found it very thought-provoking. During your talk, a quotation from the famed theologian Albus Dumbledore sprung to mind when he said, "Your failure to understand that there are things much worse than death has always been your greatest weakness." And it seems to me that in the kind of moral reasoning process, that fundamentally the ethical horizon is one beyond death. That he is thinking when he's making that judgment, the ethical horizon is one beyond death. And I suppose my question would be, if not a Christian ethic, then what is the ethic that is being engaged? As a British Army officer, we are from a country that has an established Christian religion, and when we make the choice to go to war, the kind of tradition of ethical reasoning and the political establishment is a Christian establishment. And I suppose there is never a vacuum of moral reasoning. So I understand this is the US Army and the US Marines that we're talking about, but for the British Army, I personally would think almost the default should be that in that ethical decision-making process, my horizon of thought about the correct ethical decision should be thinking beyond death is the final period, the ultimate negative. Does that make sense?
Sorry. Yeah. Is this? Yeah. So as I understand, so I'm not. So there's a decision that Tim had to make. I think maybe you're referring here to his concern for the well-being of his subordinates, right? And so that involves a series of value judgments, right? So there are people who in the Marines, you can read the literature, there are autobiographies, and their view is like, our job is to survive this. And the kind of other kinds of considerations, moral and spiritual, are things that we need to deal with when we return home. So the priority for them is protecting their subordinates from bodily injury. And Tim's, I think, faith commitments said that was, he had a different rank ordering of the relevant considerations. And my view is like those kinds of like rank ordering of different goods are inherently contentious. And because they're so contentious, it's going to be really hard to justify the claim that it was inappropriate for Tim to rely on his faith commitments to order the relevant concerns, right? So my argument is kind of a permissibility argument, and it has very little to do with like how he communicates with the subordinates, right? So he could easily appeal to some more generally acceptable claims that might help make sense of the decision for them, like appeals to the dignity of human beings without a kind of theological grounding for that. He might be able to do that, and that might be prudent and wise. But in terms of the decision that he makes, it seems perfectly appropriate for him to have relied on his faith in making the determination. How he speaks about it, how he communicates with the subordinates, is a different thing entirely, as far as I'm concerned. Does that address your concern at all?
No, it does. No, it does. I guess I just was asking, in the way he reasons about it, why would any other alternative, why should that be preferable? What is, I guess, why wouldn't the Christian default be the default?
Oh, well, I mean, I think this just goes, there's a long-running argument in sort of like liberal political theory about the inappropriateness of imposing your religion on other people, right? And what Tim is doing is he's making a decision, a life and death decision, that's justified decisively, in his view, by his faith commitments. And for a lot of people, that's just, you've clearly just gone off the rails when you do that. I mean, I can say this is true of some liberal political philosophers, It's certainly true of military types. Like I've discussed cases like this with folks in the military for 20 years or so. And for different reasons than philosophers have, very, very skeptical of people who rely on their faith to make military decisions. Very skeptical of that. And my view is it's really important that they do that. And this is not mentioned in the text, but I'm implicitly sort of like resisting a certain conception of how religion and war and violence relate to one another. And the idea that a lot of people have, it's kind of common cultural assumptions, is that when you mix religion and war, right, this is just an explosive combination. We've just learned, there's a whole narrative that we have in our culture about how that's supposed to work. The Crusades, whatever. And I think that that's not right. I think that the aggression and violence like bleeds from secularity. Those Marines in that platoon didn't need any religious justification at all to go off the rails. And in Tim's case, the religious provides a constraint on the secular rationale that led his fellow Marines to want to be far more aggressive than I think is appropriate and that Tim thought was appropriate. So religion can play a useful restraining role. And the more determined the piety, the more beneficial in some cases, right?
Very good. We've got a number of questions. First, Nigel, and then we'll go back to Chuck. Stephen, just to give you a heads up.
So, Chris, thank you. One statement and one question. The statement is that, yes, after I had my mind bended by trying to figure out what I thought about intentionality, which, as you know, is rather complex, I did eventually end up defining identifying intending with wanting, and saying that no one should ever want the death or harm to the good of the life of another. Therefore, soldiers should never intend or want to kill the enemy. That hit the buffers about 8 years ago in this room when Tom Simpson, former captain in the Royal Marines, made me realize that I do in fact think that sometimes judicial execution is moral. Therefore, I cannot deny in some cases the intention to end life is moral. But that's where my thinking stopped. I haven't thought about it since. So I'm aware that I need to go back and think about it. The question is this. When you say, you say that the Stebbings troops intended to kill insurgents of Fallujah. Why did you not say Stebbings troops intended to disable insurgents of Fallujah? With the practical certainty, given the means they used, they would probably kill them, but should some of the insurgents survive, their mission would have been accomplished and they would have taken it no further. Therefore, their intention primarily was to disable, not to kill. Why don't you say that?
Yeah. So, sorry. One of your main values, Nigel, I think, is to have your views be taken seriously by people who are in the field, right? That's one of the things that I admire most about what you do. And the language of killing and the necessity of killing is just rife in the military. But not as an end in itself, as a means to an end. And so here's an example, right? This is the language. So the Marines get into Fallujah. They learn that their enemy is drug enhanced. They're taking amphetamines and a variety of drugs to help them continue to fight. And they're told, like normally in the military, I have this on authority, not my own personal experience, of course. Normally you'll shoot at center mass, right? That's the most effective way of disabling somebody. It turns out that that's not effective at disabling Marine enemies who are hopped up on amphetamines. So they're directed, and Tim directs his subordinates to shoot at the head, not at the chest. And so, I mean, I guess you could say, right, well, they're really still just intending to kill somebody, but what you're trying to do is, to blow their head off. Can you intend to blow someone's head off and not intend to kill them? Theoretically, perhaps, right? But in terms of like the way people understand what they do, that strikes me as not a very helpful way of their embracing their vocation, I think. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
Chuck in the back.
Thanks, Chris. This was wonderful. Just a quick question and then a quick follow-up. Were there casualties incurred on his Marines that were disproportionate to the other platoons in the company? And did that come up? And the second question is there a difference between risking your own life out of your convictions and, as an officer, risking your subordinates' lives?
Right, absolutely. That's, one of the main concerns is, like, when I have talked with Tim about this and sort of reflected on this, you refer to movies that you've seen, right? What does Tim sound a lot like? The sort of Green Lieutenant who shows up and out of his idealism or inexperience gets people killed, right? That's kind of what it sounds like sometimes to me. What in fact happened is he had no one killed in his platoon the whole time he was there in Fallujah. That's his testimony to that. And so no one was in fact killed, but they could have been. And my view is that that's just the nature of military officership, right? You have to make unbelievably contentious decisions grounded on very contentious moral commitments that seem just like religious claims in terms of their sort of inherent plausibility. They're subjective in ways that are very similar. And so it's just a consistency argument at a certain point, right? Every officer is going to have to do this on the basis of some particular personal moral vision. The fact that your moral vision is religious in nature seems to me to be irrelevant. Okay, you want to say something back, Chuck?
No, just that is kind of answering the second part of the question about, do you think there's a difference between risking yourself?
Yeah, that's the nature of being an officer in the military, is that you impose risk on your subordinates. Right? And so you can think about it this way, right? The folks who want the more aggressive policies are also imposing risks on their subordinates. Risk of what? Of moral injury, right? Of separation from God, so Tim thought. So you just can't be an officer and fight in Fallujah without making decisions that impose really risk on your subordinates. Absolutely. So given that it's impossible to avoid, it's permissible for him to make the decision.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to leave a number of runners stranded. We have time for one more question, and you're the next in line. Just behind Jonathan, so
it's really
apologies.
I suppose a tactical question or one of moral imagination.
You gave the 4 options for entry. Why aren't there options like tear gas or other ways to try to smoke out people, et cetera, et cetera? We could go on a variety of that would seem to incapacitate, but not be much less lethal even than those 4 options.
Yeah. There are non-lethal means that could be used under some sort. I just think that they're not always effective, and so this is going to be a judgment that the particular officer is going to use. One thing that I didn't make clear was that obviously there are a lot more than 4 options. There's just there's a gradation, right? And that's one of the reasons why, to be more sort of technical philosophically, right? Those kind of graded judgments. The issue is about how much risk did his Marines have a duty to assume. And that, given that the means available to them are just a continuum from a greater aggression than his Marines required or wanted, less aggression than Tim opted for, right? There's just a continuum. And those kind of sort of decisions, we human beings don't have the cognitive capacities to make with anything like certainty or demonstration. And that's why that opens up room for the religious, right? Tim had no demonstrative argument for the more cautious policy, right? Someone could have said, why not a more cautious policy? Absolutely. Or a more aggressive policy. And at a certain point, you're just relying on your particular ranking of the relevant considerations. And that's the epistemology of that is what? Does anyone have a story about that? I don't have a story about that. It's just inherently subjective and therefore makes room for the religious. That's it.
Very, very good. We unfortunately have to leave it there, but this is why God made lunch. So Jonathan, please corner him there. Don't let him eat. Ask your questions, but it is time to move on. So thank you, Chris Eberle, for...
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you, Chris, for that terrific paper. I'm going to offer some reflections on academic freedom and public reason. Recent years have witnessed energetic controversies swirling around the long-standing presumption that academic freedom is the enabling condition for flourishing universities. In the absence of that function, it has long been presumed the university cannot contribute to the common good, since it is that freedom that equips it to facilitate the proper workings of public deliberation and public reason through the preservation, the propagation, and the pursuit of truth, and the persistent scrutiny of received wisdom. That normative ideal of academic freedom has attracted criticism from various points on the political spectrum. Historically, the most forceful objections have tended to emerge from the right. Some conservatives allege that where a university is founded on confessional grounds, placing institutional primacy on academic freedom threatens its intellectual culture. It means that where they're founded on confessional grounds, there can't be any substantive challenge to the grounds on which it has been founded without dissolving the basic character and organizing horizon of that intellectual culture. Conservatives have also worried that Mill elevated freedom of expression as a weapon to eradicate the despotism of custom, and conservatives tend to like custom, and to inaugurate a vision for society that facilitated Mill's often disastrous experiments in living and accelerated social progress by abandoning tradition and convention and custom. Others have argued from the right that the cause of academic freedom is nothing less than a mechanism disingenuously cloaked as intellectual neutrality for undermining the values of Western civilization itself, values that universities ought to celebrate as universally applicable moral achievements, especially when set against the totalitarian and collectivist ideologies that were, when these arguments were being made in the 50s and 60s in the United States, that when the collectivist ideologies were afflicting so many other parts of the world. Today, however, by far the most trenchant opposition to academic freedom comes from the progressive left, and that may seem surprising. In a recent popular history of free speech published last month, Jacob Mchangama has shown how vital a tool free expression has been for historically marginalized groups to achieve legal emancipation and political recognition. But for many in the university today, academic freedom is a smokescreen for pursuing and promoting teaching and research that threatens the psychological well-being of members of marginalized groups. Where once protest movements depended on the license to speak freely, campus activism today tends to psychologize Mill's harm principle and redeploy it to grant a heckler's veto to the most emotionally vulnerable members of the academic community. Now, it seems to me that all of these criticisms are motivated by plausible concerns. Addressing them fully here will take a little bit more time than I've got available to me now, but I have done so in the longer version of this paper, and perhaps we can touch on them in discussion afterwards. For now, let me simply lay them on the table as reminders that the case for free expression and the case for academic freedom within and beyond the university is by no means self-evident, and as recent surveys are revealing, by no means as widely accepted in liberal democracies as it used to be. It's therefore always worth returning to and rehearsing that case. The seminal text, of course, is Chapter 2 of Mill's On Liberty. Mill offers three or four arguments from the truth-seeking function of free expression. First, you might be wrong. Since a countervailing opinion may be true, to prevent its expression is to assume, quote, our own infallibility. Second, chances are you're a little bit right and a little bit wrong, but you're never going to know which bits are right and which bits are wrong if you don't expose your views to the scrutiny of criticism, free criticism. And third, he who knows only his own side knows little of that. I think the most interesting argument from Mill there. You don't, even if you're completely right, you don't truly understand why you're right, and you won't defend it rigorously if you haven't exposed it to the best that could be thrown against it. So that's a sort of case for free expression, standard case for free expression 101. Now, the defense of academic freedom, with which most of us will be familiar, does draw on this basic approach. Academic freedom, it is said, should be valued because it embeds within the university the optimal conditions for the preservation of truth, the pursuit of truth, and the promulgation of truth. Environments that are decentralized provide far more efficient conditions for preserving, pursuing, and promulgating truth because they aggregate the intellectual judgments of individuals in ways that ecosystems that are centrally planned or burdened with powerful hierarchical structures to achieve that aim tend not to do. This is a kind of Hayekian argument, the marketplace of ideas argument. Some of you will be familiar with it. Now, if, as John Dewey once put it, the university function is the truth function, it's not, of course, its only function. One enduring contribution of the McDonald Centre via its annual conference in 2016, I think, and its partnership with the Oxford Character Project, has been to demonstrate that even if they don't usually realise it, universities are also in the business of cultivating character. Universities also perform an important credentialing function for the professional sector, and so on. But it is the truth-seeking function that remains the best justification available for the substantial, often lavish, public subsidy bestowed on universities in the United Kingdom, as opposed to, say, a think tank, a research institute, or a vocational college. Enshrining academic freedom as a professional privilege should enhance, is designed to enhance, discursive reasoning in the public square. It enables citizens to hold executive, legislative, and judicial decision-making to account. And finally, it helps to inform the electorate, basic democratic function. The democratic process involves citizens and their representatives giving reasons and asking for reasons, and those reasons must include reasons to believe they are true, and not merely what they're being told is instrumentally useful. Although they share this truth-seeking function, academic freedom and free speech involve different rights, different contexts. Academic freedom is not a license for bare, unfettered speech. Academic freedom is protected speech. It confers a social status on those who possess it, a status that other citizens and most other professionals do not enjoy. The logic of that settlement is that it ensures that the pursuit of truth and the testing of received wisdom in the academy is invested with an authority that it would not have otherwise. It means that those who enjoy the protection can and should be held responsible for what they say, and to a far higher standard than the ordinary citizen. It means that they are not at liberty to complain that they are being coerced, or that what they say in their teaching and research is anything other than what they intended to say. Moreover, where speech is protected in this way, and crucially widely acknowledged and accepted to be protected, withholding a contribution carries as much weight as a positive intervention on the basis that silence on a topic will not be attributed to fear of adverse repercussions. Silence speaks within a guild. What topics are ignored is just as important as the topics that are addressed. The American political philosopher Philip Pettit has recently argued that since academic freedom applies protection to speakers on the basis of their membership of a profession, the dynamics of professionalization operate in a way that generates what he calls an economy of esteem between academics. And that, he thinks, limits abuses of academic freedom as a norm, because advancing indefensible positions, such as Holocaust denial, would be treated as an egregious breach of widely recognized professional standards, and these standards would tend to have the effect of excluding from the guild the defense of unjustifiable heterodoxies. The economy of esteem in a discipline provides, Pettit claims, a powerful prima facie defense of academic freedom as a protected professional privilege. It guards against the risk of the abuse of that privilege by imposing a social cost on those who engage in indefensible speech. And Pettit's claim relies on the presumption that a discipline warrants this privilege because it is capable of self-governance in virtue of the collective judgment of the guild to regulate speech by means of a largely emergent and continually shifting hierarchy of esteem within the guild, and that informally corrects or ratifies the appropriate parameters for the acceptable expression of ideas within the guild. That is why, for example, the historian David Irving did not need to be sanctioned in the late 1990s by law for expressing skepticism about the nature and extent of the Holocaust. His immediate pariah status within the discipline was sufficient to discredit him as a reliable historian within the guild and by extension in the eyes of the general public. Nothing more needed to be done. And yet, it turns out that current protections of academic freedom in the United Kingdom, at least, and like Professor O'Donovan last night, I will confine myself strictly to the United Kingdom, are failing to insulate economies of esteem against the distorting pressures of polarization. Academic communities are, it turns out, no less vulnerable than any other profession to so-called social cascades in the formation of group opinion. Originality of thought, bold scholarship are still prized in the research university. But on sensitive and consequential questions, conformity is always less costly than dissent, and scholars are not immune to this basic truth of human social psychology. Compared to many other professional guilds, academic disciplines are relatively small and typically constellated into even smaller clusters of scholars devoted to carefully circumscribed domains of intellectual inquiry. That tends to raise the social cost of expressing dissent on sensitive questions, especially on questions where there's a strongly embedded existing consensus, and that provides social incentives to prefer conformity. It also means that when it does occur, ideological capture happens too quickly to resist it. Extensive empirical work over the last 5 years in particular has demonstrated beyond reasonable doubt, I think, that ideological polarization and asymmetries in political viewpoint in the university sector on both sides of the Atlantic, I will venture to say, have reached unprecedented levels. Activist academics think nothing of shutting down debates, cancelling visiting speakers, organizing online harassment campaigns, blocking research funding, policing admissions and appointments, and managing scholarship and lectureship funds for ends that are plainly antithetical to their original purpose. This caucus, to be clear, represents a relatively small minority, but it is a determined minority. And it is a minority that, because it is determined, can exercise a power wholly disproportionate to its size by generating a social dynamic that the sociologist Elizabeth Noel Neumann has once described as the spiral of silence. The spiral of silence happens where an active and vocal minority can catalyzes the formation of an illusory consensus by discouraging the majority from expressing its views, to the point where its silence is construed as tacit assent. As the illusion of consensus spreads, the resisting minority appears to dwindle to vanishing point. It then becomes straightforward to dismiss, in a sort of mopping up operation, anyone resisting the spiral of silence as eccentric or, worse, as morally suspect. Groupthink almost always turns wrongthink into evilthink. What we are witnessing, I think, is a version of the tragedy of the commons. Broad intellectual conformity is individually rational, but collectively costly. And while intellectual dissent is individually costly, but collectively beneficial. One troubling consequence of these developments is that they prevent the university from discharging its duty to inform public deliberations and to steer those deliberations through technically demanding and ethically complex questions underpinning law and public policy. Worse, the illusion of consensus on a fraught question within the nation's professional and protected intellectual elite renders public disagreement scarcely intelligible. It creates a cascade of negative sentiment throughout the rest of the elite class towards dissenting views in the public square, views that are often disproportionately associated with socioeconomically disadvantaged groups, which in turn incubates support for populist causes and widens social division. In the United Kingdom, these guild dynamics are being exacerbated by a constellation of so-called kite-marking organizations that incentivize universities and university departments by means of funding or public recognition to express collective commitments on questions about which the general public, to the extent that it is ever properly informed of them, is profoundly divided. The language of these pledges is often coated with a kind of hyper-progressive patois, a constantly evolving idiolect designed to signal membership of an ideological elite. To take one example, considerable momentum is building across the university sector to secure institutional allegiance to controversial views about the nature and extent of racial discrimination in the United Kingdom. Views that are plainly contestable and with which many more academics would express disagreement if the risks of doing so were not so high. These claims include the view that higher education in the United Kingdom is afflicted with, quote, structural race inequality, that the United Kingdom is a systemically racist society, that the only remedy for discrimination in the past is discrimination in the present, that disparities between demographic groups are always and everywhere caused by direct discrimination, and that to be truly opposed to racism, one must also be opposed to capitalism. All of these truths might well be true. All of these claims might well be true. But none of them is self-evidently true. They are claims that reasonable people within and beyond the walls of the university can and do contest with sincerity and vigor. Any institution that takes seriously its duty to enhance public deliberation on these neuralgic but weighty matters cannot afford to enshrine a single perspective in that deliberation as an institutional value. On the contrary, the university must give oxygen to every lawful and defensible view without elevating any one of them above the dialectical scrutiny and justificatory standards applied to every other. If it is true that internal ideological pressures, threats to academic freedom are overwhelming higher education, what solutions are there that could recall universities to their founding ideals? Well, I think the short answer is not many. But in the Queen's speech on Tuesday, the government renewed its commitment to steer through Parliament the first piece of legislation in the West to tackle the current crisis of academic freedom. It is now likely that the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill will receive royal assent before the end of the year. The legislation would impose an active duty on higher education institutions to, quote, promote the importance of freedom of speech and academic freedom, where academic freedom is defined as, quote, freedom within the law and within their field of expertise, A, to question and test received wisdom, and B, to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves at risk of being adversely affected. Needless to say, it's a source of concern to many of us that the government is resorting to what many see as unacceptably stringent constraints on the institutional autonomy of universities, and that the legislation contradicts a core principle of academic freedom. After all, academic freedom, or libertas scholastica, emerged as a normative institutional ideal primarily to protect the civil and corporate privileges of the medieval university from, it is thought, this kind of external pressure. Legislative intervention in the intellectual culture of a university is going to seem disproportionate and disturbing to many. Nevertheless, as Eric Kaufman and Thomas Simpson have argued, it cannot be the case that the autonomy of an institution is compromised by external mechanisms that determine whether it has breached its legal obligations, especially in cases where the institution in question is suspected of breaching them. That is to say, where the institution in question is alleged to be party to the breach. Moreover, as I noted earlier, there are countlessly many extramural organizations that enthusiastically enforce norms against discrimination on the basis of sexuality, race, and gender. And since that is so, it would be wholly arbitrary not to permit similar oversight with respect to discrimination on the basis of sincerely held religious, philosophical, and political beliefs as well. There are some grounds for hope that the legislation will exercise a chastening effect on universities. Law, after all, has an expressive function. It creates, it embeds social norms. What a piece of legislation expresses can modify the behavior of those within its jurisdiction without direct enforcement. This function of law plays a crucial role in solving problems of coordination and collective action by imposing social sanctions that deter those tempted to violate the norms it expresses. The law also has the power to shape the stance of the general public on a complex ethical question, as was obviously the case, for instance, with levels of public acceptance of same-sex marriage before and after the passing of the Marriage Same-Sex Couples Act 2013 in the United Kingdom and the Supreme Court's decision in Obergefell and Hodges in 2015 in the United States. The law has an expressive function and it has a pedagogical function. Law not only signals to citizens how they ought to behave, but also how others believe they ought to behave. And so one reasonable aim of the legislation is that even though enforcing it is going to be complex and messy, its expressive effect will encourage universities to establish political non-discrimination as a prevailing institutional norm, just as equality legislation a decade or so ago dramatically shifted institutional culture towards norms against discrimination on the basis of other characteristics. Dispassionate observers of the purity spirals engulfing some of this nation's most precious institutional assets may suspect that this imperfect remedy has come far too late. Those involved in the discussions that led to the emergence of the legislation are certainly sanguine about its likely effects. But there can be no doubt that it is the most promising antidote thus far to the poisoning of the wells of public reason by a new ideological clerisy that has sprung up in the very institutions the people entrusted to purify them. And any success this remedy does achieve will be due in no small part to the work of this centre, not least the annual conference it held on academic freedom in 2019, that has borne more fruit than anyone could have predicted at the time. But it is the person whom we are honouring in this year's conference, and to whom I offer these reflections by way of paltry exchange for many years of wise counsel, who has done as much as anyone to recall the university to its proper vocation of exemplifying to the nation, to the church, and to the world how democratic deliberation should be conducted and how wisdom should be sought and tested and won.
Very good. You know the routine. Please. Down here in front to begin.
Hi.
Wait for the microphone, please.
Yeah, thank you, James. I'm in heartfelt agreement with everything you say. I think one should say a little bit more, though, about some of the social and economic factors that I think have contributed to this climate of intolerance that you outlined. I'll mention just three. I mean, one is the way in which research is increasingly tied to particular government-dictated agendas. Second is the way in which universities increasingly keep junior academics on short-term contracts for many years. And the third is the lifting of the caps on student numbers, which has made attracting students and therefore student satisfaction such a central goal of many universities. All these three things, I think, have made it increasingly difficult to discuss unpopular ideas within the university. So do you have anything to say on that?
Absolutely, thank you, Ed. And I know we've talked about these issues before. Yes, I couldn't agree more that marketisation has been a serious problem, and I don't want to be a cheerleader for previous government interventions in the university sector at all. I think on the whole they've been pretty disastrous in skewing research agendas in all sorts of unhelpful ways. So yes, hearty agreement on that. I think there are also very serious concerns about how underfunding incentivizes dubious funding from elsewhere. I think there are significant geopolitical risks, for example, arising from China's intervention in the higher education sector. There's a lot of work being done on that, which I find deeply alarming, particularly in Cambridge, and Jesus College, to some extent, it has received some money for its China Centre, which has done very good things, but is conspicuously silent on some of the human rights abuses that China and the CCP and CCP adjacent funders, including funders to Jesus, have been involved in. So yes, I couldn't agree more. It is a concern. It's not simply coming from internal dynamics. There are external flaws in the incentive structures as well, and they need to be addressed.
I think up there, Daniel first, and then down below.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask a question coming from the University of Notre Dame, which has to do with the place of academic freedom at a religious university. And so I strongly accept your arguments for academic freedom. And I would argue that they're compatible with a religious university's efforts to promote its religious identity. I would make a distinction between the sphere of deliberation and the sphere of administration. So deliberation would be classroom, campus newspaper debates, speakers, and so forth, fully, widely governed by freedom. Administration would be efforts to hire, to govern student life, dormitories, even make funding decisions to fund certain kinds of research and so forth without compromising freedom. But I have interlocutors on both sides who would disagree. Some would say that the university's administrative efforts to shape the religious character violates academic freedom. Others say that universities that are religious should not have academic freedom in the same way, that they should be fully open about promoting the religious identity all the way through. But I would argue that these two spheres can and should be held without contradiction in the religious university. Might be a few tensions, but where do you come down on that debate?
Thank you. Well, there's a clear advantage to a religious institution in the sense that it's explicit about its organizing horizon, shall we say. And that includes a commitment that not to pursuing and seeking truth, but really it begins with the presumption that it's found the truth and it's exploring the truth or testing the truth and working out new ways to pass on the truth. And I'm well aware of criticisms from the right against academic freedom for precisely this, that it undermines that status. I think where public subsidy is involved, it becomes a lot harder. What's interesting, though, and I think this is something Newman identifies very well in his lectures in the 1850s on the idea of a university, is that there's always going to be some organizing horizon. And that's going to creep back in if you simply abandon the theological one. And one plausible explanation, I think, is that we do now have a new organizing horizon that is built around a new ideology, a new understanding of what it is to be human and what it is to flourish as a human being. And it's a vision that needs to be taken seriously. It needs to be scrutinized. It can't simply sort of by accident become that organizing horizon. The reason it is, though, is because of the increasing power of administration. And I suppose I'm less confident than you are that the administrative side and the pedagogical side can be set distinguished. If there is close administrative oversight of admissions and appointments, then that just is going to have an enormous impact on the pedagogical culture. If administration is effectively deciding on collective institutional statements about what that institution takes to be important, values that it takes to be important, values in the 20th century sense that Professor O'Donovan defined yesterday, then maintaining that distinction, maintaining that boundary, I think just becomes wholly implausible. But maybe it's easier in a context like Notre Dame. I'm not sure.
Professor Kumar?
I'm entirely share your concerns, James, about what's going on in the universities today as far as academic freedom is concerned. And I think you might be right that some kind of legislative intervention, particularly in the case of public institutions, which is the case with all the British universities, at least, if not the American ones, might be helpful. But I'm just wondering whether universities really are the place where the worst offences of this kind are occurring. I think universities seem to be latecomers in this game, and that might be part of the problem. They're not very experienced at dealing with these questions, and certainly many of the people running the universities have very little experience and knowledge of how to handle them, and they've done them very clumsily. I'm thinking particularly of a particular example, the case of Roger Scruton, the late Roger Scruton, the philosopher, who used to say that his problem was not that he wasn't getting invitations from universities and student bodies and things of that kind. He never seemed to feel that that was why he was constantly being vilified in various sections of the media. But it was more to do with certain institutions of what we might call civil society that were constraining him. That partly involved the media, broadcasting institutions, certain newspapers. He felt much of the vilification, much of the difficulties he had to face came from those kinds of institutions. So I'm just wondering whether focusing on, I mean, we're all academics, or most of us, of course, we're concerned with our own institutions, but whether that's where the worst of the problems are to be faced. I wonder whether Nigel might not also want to comment on his own experiences in this respect with the way in which certain publishers have acted and certain newspapers in some of the controversies he's been involved in.
Thank you. I suppose Roger is a special case in the sense that, he really left university and left the university as a profession in the late 1980s, and that's what sort of enabled him to start writing, so widely. So I think he was less attuned to the sort of dynamics that I was describing in the university context, which have really begun in the last sort of 10, 15 years, though he was not unaware of them, of course, and had his own battles in the media space. I think you're absolutely right about the sort of rabbit in the headlights phenomenon of institutions faced with an angry tantrum on Twitter. In November 2014, shortly after I arrived here to take up my postdoctoral fellowship at the centre, I had a little room up here, and we booked this theatre for a debate on abortion we had Brendan O'Neill was coming, I think, to do the pro-choice side, and we had Timothy Stanley from the Telegraph doing the pro-life side, and that debate was shut down by the college authorities. And when I tried to point out that letting it happen and allowing the protesters front row seats and the right to ask as many questions as they want before anyone else for as long as they want, that this would be a far better way to handle it, both in terms of as a point of principle, but also in terms of reputational protection. They simply didn't accept those arguments, and what I predicted came to pass. Within a week, there was an international media firestorm, and in fact, only last week I was reading an account of troubles in the universities, which cited that very incident from 8 years ago. So I think that it would be a very good idea, I think, if university administrators and faculty administrators had a sort of an action plan and sort of an emergency protocols to what to do when these pressures rear themselves, because what seems like a short-term solution is in fact going to build up all sorts of reputational and legal risks for the institution further down the line.
Nigel, do you want to take up the invitation to respond?
Just briefly to comment. I mean, I guess so Krishan's question really was whether universities are latecomers to this and therefore they're mishandling as a result of lack of experience. I'm not sure whether they are latecomers or whether James is right that universities were where it began. So your incident, James, was 8 years ago. I first fell into controversy 5 years ago. Krishan alluded to the cancellation of my book on colonialism by the commissioning publisher Bloomsbury in March of last year. My sense is that, for sure, the disease is widespread through society, and we've seen in this country leaders of all sorts of cultural institutions, museums, for example, fall uncritically before the current zeitgeist. And those people are experienced, at least in terms of management administration, and they will be in their 40s or 50s. I think this has been brewing for a generation, and the symptoms have emerged rapidly all over the place, but certainly in universities.
Why don't we pass it down? Just continue the woman in Nigel's row.
As most of you don't know me, I'm Honora O'Neill. I wanted to ask you a very simple question. Why do you think offence has become such a crucial term in these debates? It seems to me that offence is in the eye of the beholder, and my goodness, some people are more easily offended than others. But what warrants treating offence as the crucial failing?
Thank you. Well, I referred briefly in passing to the way in which I think Mill's harm principle has been psychologized. Mill is actually very clear to distinguish physical harm from any other kind of harm, the psychological offence. But I think that's what's happened. And so I think there's an incentive behind what the Australian psychologist Nick Haslam has called concept creep. Ian Hacker, I think, calls it dynamic nominalism, where terms that belong to diagnostic and statistic manuals have emerged into the public square and are now being used and weaponized. So think of the way in which the language of trauma, offense, gaslighting even, these start to become very, very powerful weapons, where in a culture where, as it were, psychological well-being is the sort of a kind of the primary overriding good. When I asked why the college authorities here cancelled the debate, refused to give permission because I hadn't filled in the right form, they said that the answer that they gave was that they were concerned about the emotional safety of female undergraduates who may or may not contemplate terminating a pregnancy. And that was dispositive as a response. And so we're in a very difficult conflict between two fundamentally different visions of what a university is for. Is it for truth-seeking or is it for coddling? And I'm with Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff that increasingly now we're seeing the coddling of the Cambridge mind and the coddling of the Oxford mind. Only last week it was announced in Cambridge, a proposal came out to suggest that there should be trigger warnings. This is the latest import from the United States, with the delicious twist that they were not to be called trigger warnings because trigger warnings risked being too triggering. They were to be referred to as content guidance. This humanities-wide initiative, it turns out, was based on research by a master's student and a graduate student in the Faculty of Education was rubber stamped and laundered all the way up through the university and is now making its way through the various faculties.
Very good. This gentleman's been waiting here down below in the middle.
Thanks for such a great presentation, James. Now, one thing that you identified that I think is really important is what I would call an academic covenant, so that we might expect academic freedom in return for the reflective wisdom that we bring to our discipline. And I guess my question to you is this something that academics are aware of either implicitly or explicitly? And is it something that is anyway being grasped in sort of the more popular culture, this idea of an academic covenant, which I think is a really important one and would help people think more constructively about the whole issue?
Thank you. Yes, well, the legislation would impose a statutory duty on every higher education institution to actively to promote academic freedom and freedom of speech as a sort of overriding institutional norm. Hopefully, the statutory guidance will unpack a little bit what that looks like, what best practice looks like. So I'm going to be urging, well, I think it would be a very good idea to urge for there to be, if there's an Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee, there needs to be at least a subcommittee of that committee stressing that the Equality Act protects dissenting philosophical beliefs, protects dissenting religious beliefs, and so on and so forth. Or perhaps there will be sort of rival pieces of infrastructure, doesn't really bear thinking about, that satisfy those statutory obligations to promote academic freedom. But I think the power, law has an expressive power, institutions have an expressive power, and they have to be very cautious how they exercise that power. My concern is, particularly in the summer of 2020, for reasons we'll all be familiar with, there was a whole series of statements. Virtually, there was no institution in the land that had not made its views clear, but in doing so often aligned that institution with a movement that was explicitly signed up to extremely contentious conceptions of society, what was wrong with society and what should be done about it. And some institutions have retracted those statements, but they're not easy to retract. Once they're made, they're basically irreversible. And so I think if there could be a norm, not just for the active promotion of academic freedom, but a kind of restriction or an insistence on strict institutional neutrality on plausibly contestable questions, that would be a very good start.
The bell tolls. We have time for one more question. There's several hands up. Will anybody be particularly triggered if they don't get to ask their question? She's boldly raising her hand.
Thank you very much. You talked a lot about the content question with respect to academic freedom, but not so much about the form question. And just the incident that happened, not an incident, but what happened just a few seconds ago made me wonder, so is not also the form question as relevant as the content question, in the sense of why do we laugh about the sort of proposal that you just spoke about the trigger warning? So what does it tell us about ourselves that we laugh about something like that? Is that a way of having a good conversation about these sort of things?
It's a good question. I think, and I tried in the talk to stress that what's motivating this new ideology are not ignoble aspirations, and they need to be taken seriously, and they need to be the logic of identitarianism needs to be given a fair hearing, and it does need to be taken seriously. It is sometimes easy to satirize, but we should be free to satirize it if we so choose, just as religious views are satirized, and people should be free to satirize them. But I take your point. I mean, it's easy to mock well-intentioned ideas, but I think there's a real concern when ideas that meet with widespread laughter when discussed in a room are being pushed through unscrutinized across the entire humanities division of one of the world's leading universities. That disconnect is troubling. So we'll all laugh about it, but no one's really going to do anything about it. It's going to happen. The revolution continues.
To be continued over lunch. Dr. Oro, thank you very much.